Hi, and welcome to another episode of Hot Takes with me, the Silver Fox. Now, one piece of really good news, of course, is that independence is never really going to happen. And that is good, because if it did, the amount of taxes that would have to be levied on individuals, on companies, on products, on, well, everything, would be so devastating as to completely destroy the entire economy, simply to enable the Nats to have their wet dream of a one-party Marxist state. So thank heavens the people of Scotland are not stupid enough to go independent. However, Humza Yousaf has been asked to admit this, to tell people how much taxes would have to go up by in order to fulfil this dream. And of course he's not prepared to do that. Partially because he probably doesn't know, and also because even if he did know, he knows full well he daren't tell people. People would reject it. It would be subject to what I believe is called consumer resistance, especially if you knew that 60, 70 or even 80% of your earnings would go in tax and everything else would be spent on just staying alive. Let's have a look at this to see how bad it could be and why Humza Yousaf is absolutely saying nothing about how much the taxes would be. Here goes. So Humza Yousaf urged to come clean about a need for dramatic tax rises and public sector cuts in an independent Scotland. Now you've seen how much cuts there have been so far, and that's in a Scotland backed up by Westminster and the Barnett Agreement. Imagine how much worse it would be if you didn't have that. Already you got the highest taxes in Britain and the biggest cuts in services. Imagine getting worse. Imagine an extra 10, 15, 20% on your taxes and half the services currently being cut even further. Simply just to pay the bills, simply just to keep the lights on. It is unbelievably bad. But of course he wouldn't be bothered. He would still be on his huge salary. He wouldn't be hungry, cold, frightened. No siree, Bob. And also with his wonderful private health insurance, he wouldn't be worried about getting ill either. The First Minister has been told that the SNP needs to admit that Scotland, after Skexit, would plunge into austerity in order to be like comparator countries he has repeatedly mentioned, like Denmark and Finland. Although Finland is sitting next to Russia, which is not perhaps the best place to be, and so not a very good comparator. But certainly you'd have income tax rates like Denmark, if not possibly higher, but you wouldn't have the services that Denmark has because of those very high income tax rates. Humza Yousaf has been urged to admit that there will be dramatic tax rises and or public spending cuts in an independent Scotland. It can't do anything else, can there? You won't have the income. Your per head, your per capita costs would go up. Would go up, but your per capita income would reduce. You won't be able to sell freely if you're independent because of various rules. If you want to join the EU, you've got to put a hard border up with England. You won't have your own currency, so you'll have the Scottish pound or equivalency, whatever you call it, which would float onto the markets and sink like a stone because there's nothing backing it up. Sure, you've got an oil industry, but of course your policies now are to destroy the oil industry. So, what have you got? Independence is just a wet dream and it will never, ever happen. He's set to expand on this during his speeches that he's been delivering yesterday, today and tomorrow. However, he has been warned that if he wants to replicate the aforementioned countries, he will need to commit to a period of austerity for a number of years, something which the SNP has yet to publicly say. They daren't say it. They daren't stand there and tell you you've got to go hungry. Pro-union think tank These Islands have published research which claimed that Mr Yousaf's insistence on comparing an independent country with other, what he calls similar-sized countries, would mean adopting their fiscal policies as well. Public spending as a percentage of GDP would need to drop year on year until the country's deficit was less than 3% of GDP. including North Sea oil, which was buoyant due to restrictions on Russia. This was minus 6.4%. But excluding the industry, the S&P, which the S&P want to shut down, it was a huge minus 12%. Mr. Yousaf will also reference the Resolution Foundation report, which claims that driving economic growth should be done by targeting resilient public finances and rebuilt public services. And that, of course, costs. But what's he going to spend? He hasn't got any money. And he wants to get rid of oil, so he's got no income. And you can only sell so much whiskey. There's only so much capacity. What else have you got? Let's face it, if you've got all the beef, the Scottish beef and lamb and whatever, but if you've got a closed border, you can't just traipse it straight into England. And of course, you've got all the trade barriers and trade controls. All of a sudden, everything is expensive to buy in and everything is expensive to sell out. Good luck. Of course, it isn't going to happen. You can rest easy. Nobody is going to vote for independence because nobody is stupid. Well, of course, the SNP voters are stupid enough, but nobody with any sense is stupid enough. And thankfully, there's enough people clever enough to know how awful and bad it will be. It also adds that a tighter fiscal policy will have to be run in good times and recommends a target for tax revenues to cover day-to-day spending, a current budget balance rule. And these islands chairman Kevin Haig pointed to Italy as a case study in productivity decline, which showed that there was repeated concerns over fiscal sustainability and political instability as reinforcing factors. Now, Italy's had more governments since the Second World War than just about any country in the world. It's amazing how Italy still functions. But one of the basic rules that Italy does is it doesn't interfere and muck about with its industries. It lets the industries get on with themselves. But he said that many would argue that these are precisely the conditions that would exist in an independent Scotland, newly separated from the UK, conditions which would be further exacerbated by erecting a trade border with Scotland's largest export market, breaking up the UK's welfare state, losing the benefit of fiscal pooling and sharing, dismantling the GB energy market, creating uncertain currency regime, unpicking shared machinery of state and defence assets, and much, much more disruption. Here's the thing. Those pretendy embassies would have to become real embassies. You'd need 198 of them, 200 of them, because you've also got one for the EU, one for the various different places. There's two there, and there's one here, and new countries forming. Basically, 200 embassies. How much is that going to cost? Who's paying for these embassies? Your defence. Who's paying for that? Who's paying for this? You know, who's going to pay to run your banks? Because you're going to need a central bank, and you're going to need an international credit office, and you're going to need a trade office, and you're going to need your own separate stock markets and things like this. All got to be set up. Who's going to pay for them? Who's going to work in them? You've only got 5.5 million people in Scotland, and once you take everyone working for the state out of it and take everyone who's too young or too old, you've got a very small workforce. They've got to generate all the costs. Tax is going to be rather high. The Economist said that the report gives Mr. Yousaf 3 key questions to answer. I suspect there's many more, which includes whether he agrees that their call for tighter fiscal policy and a rule for maintaining a current budget and balance, and whether he accepts that an independent Scotland would need to increase taxes and or cut spending as a percentage of GDP. Well, both. Absolutely both. Basically, the NHS would have to go. You just couldn't afford an NHS. Free education, that would have to go. Free prescriptions, that would have to go. They'd all have to go. Because you can't afford them. You can't afford them and a country. You have a choice. Do you want to have a country or do you want to have an NHS? Can't have both. He then urges the First Minister to explain how these will be made and how they would impact ordinary Scots. Well, ordinary Scots would be dying in the streets, and actually that's not entirely true, is it? Those who can will run, and when they run, they'll take every penny with them, and they ain't going to come back. And that is what's going to be left. The rump. Who's going to pay the pensions? Who's going to pay everything? There'll be no one working. All the workers will get out, come to England, pay less tax, have a job. Veteran Scots broadcaster Andrew Neil also hit out at the SNP leader for indulging in fantasy economics. He said this is what he's saying in the most absurd speech by any politician of recent memory. He said if we use the same analysis for countries that are similar to Scotland, such as Denmark, Ireland and Finland, the difference for the typical Scottish household would be even greater. He said they will be £10,200 better off. No, they won't, and we covered that in a video yesterday. Not a chance. He said, Barmy, in what ways are the Danish, Irish or Finnish economies similar to the Scottish economy? What, pray tell, is the Danish, Irish, Finnish equivalent of Clydeside? They haven't got one. They literally haven't. Ireland runs an economy of low taxation to encourage international companies there. Finland is a very small population that relies on a lot of internal market, doesn't buy a lot in because it's self-sufficient and drinks a vast amount of vodka. And Denmark is one of the highest taxed countries in the world with a massive and superb infrastructure for social control, health service, childcare. Scotland would have the same amount of taxes, but no services. It's all make-believe by a man living in a delusional paradise of his own making, but which for everyone else, of course, would be a sheer hell on earth of his own making. Coming up. He seems to think that if he believes it hard enough, that will make it so. But of course, that's not how the world works. The world works on how much does it cost? How are you raising the money? What are you doing with the money? And why would we vote this man in to lead a company to rack and ruin? And of course, no one will, thankfully. So it is all speculation. He can say what he likes. We all know it's never going to happen. The trouble is, he really, really wants it to happen. And so he has to answer the questions, and he knows he can't. What a sad, sad, inadequate man he truly is. Anyway, I shall stop there. Thank you very much for watching. Do please hit that subscribe button. We need all the help we can get. We're a political channel, and they keep pushing us down because the algorithm hates political channels. So please hit the subscribe button, raise us back up. Till next time, stay safe, stay well, and I will speak to you later. Bye.